Iraq has declared force majeure on all of its oil fields. Kuwait's refineries have been hit by drones. The Houthis have declared a maritime embargo on Saudi Arabia. Traffic through the Strait of Hormuz has collapsed. There have been 10 consecutive nights of American airstrikes on Iranian territory. Oil is around $90 a barrel, not $150, not $290. There is one reason for that number, and it's this: a coral island about twice the size of Heathrow Airport, sitting 15 miles off the Iranian coast. 90 to 96% of Iran's crude oil leaves the world from this island. It is, by a wide margin, the single most valuable target in this entire war. American forces have bombed it deliberately left the oil terminals standing. In the next half hour, I'm going to explain why the most bombable target in the Middle East hasn't been destroyed by the country bombing everything around it, or by the country that owns it, because the answer to that question is the answer to why you're still paying under $4 a gallon. Start with the geography, because the geography is the whole story. Karg Island sits in the northern Persian Gulf, roughly 15 to 20 miles off Iran's southern coast. It is small, a coral outcrop, described by one analysis as about twice the size of London's Heathrow Airport. And critically, it is nowhere near the Strait of Hormuz. It's about 300 miles, some 480 kilometers northwest of the strait, deep inside the Gulf. I want to flag that immediately, because a lot of coverage conflates the two. Hormuz is the choke point the world's oil passes through. Karg is where Iran's own oil is loaded. They are different places, they do different things, and confusing them will make everything that follows incomprehensible. Now, why here? Because most of Iran's coastline is too shallow. The very largest oil tankers, VLCCs, very large crude carriers, need deep water to berth. Karg happens to be surrounded by naturally deep water. That single geological accident is why Iran's entire seaborne oil trade funnels through one small island rather than being spread across a dozen ports. The terminal was commissioned around 65 years ago under Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, and it was built for a much larger oil industry than Iran currently runs. It hosts 55 storage tanks with capacity, somewhere around 31 to 34 million barrels. Loading capacity has been put as high as 5 to 7 million barrels per day. Iran's actual crude exports over the past year ran at about 1.64 million barrels per day, according to tanker tracking firm Kepler, of which roughly 1.577 million left from Karg. Do that division and you get about 96%. Other estimates put it lower. Kepler's own analysis says 94% of Iranian crude exports. The Council on Foreign Relations says roughly 90%. Britannica says nearly all. The exact figure depends on whose tanker data you use and which months you count. The point survives every version of it. This island is not one of Iran's export routes. It is functionally Iran's export route. One more thing worth knowing, because it explains why this isn't hypothetical. This has happened before. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, Iraqi forces targeted Karg repeatedly and damaged the oil terminal, forcing Iran to shift shipping to smaller facilities. At Lavan Island and Siri Island, those facilities exist, but they are smaller, shallower, and cannot handle the same volumes. So Iran has a fallback. It's just a much worse one that matters later. And the island isn't only industrial. It carries rock-cut tombs from the Achaemenid period and the remains of a Christian monastic complex. The Dutch East India Company ran a trading station there in the 18th century until they were expelled in 1765 for helping attack the mainland. People have been fighting over this rock for a very long time. March 13th and 14th, 2026, 2 weeks into the war, American forces struck Karg Island. Central Command said they hit roughly 90 military targets on the island. The stated purpose: the Revolutionary Guard had been using Karg to store naval mines and other weapons for its blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. Those storage facilities were the target. And then, the detail that this entire video is built on: the strikes deliberately avoided Karg Island's oil facilities. President Trump said so publicly on March 13th that US forces had targeted military installations on the island while leaving the oil infrastructure untouched. He also warned the oil terminals could be hit if Iran kept blocking Hormuz. Think about the precision that requires. 90 targets on an island roughly twice the size of an airport, with 55 oil storage tanks on it. And the tanks are still standing. That is not restraint born of difficulty. That is a choice made at target by target. The outcome confirms it. Iranian officials said oil operations continued and exports were not disrupted. Satellite imagery analyzed by tanker trackers showed the facilities fully operational. Recent images showing a very large crude carrier loading cargo while smaller tankers waited nearby. America bombed Iran's oil island and Iran's oil kept loading. The market read it immediately. Oil climbed back above $100 a barrel after the strikes because traders understood that if the United States was willing to bomb the island at all, the terminals were now a live target. But they stayed standing through March, through April, through Operation Epic Fury ending on May 5th, through the June 17th Memorandum of Understanding and its collapse on July 8th, and through the campaign since, on July 16th, American forces disabled a tanker with missiles near Karg and still did not touch the terminal. By one energy tracker's summary of that week, the war widened everywhere but Karg, and oil barely moved. 5 months of the most sustained American bombing campaign in decades, and the single most valuable target in the theater is untouched. Why? The answer is in Washington's own words, and it isn't subtle. On March 30th, Trump told the Financial Times he was considering seizing Karg Island to compel Tehran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. On June 11th, he was more explicit. Writing on Truth Social, he said that at some point in the not-too-distant future, the United States would be taking Karg Island and other oil infrastructure points, and assume total control of their oil and gas markets. Read that again. Total control. You cannot take total control of an oil terminal you've reduced to rubble. One military analysis put it precisely: the distinction between military and economic targets indicates an intent to preserve the export system for leverage rather than destroy it. That is the first answer. The United States doesn't want Karg destroyed. It wants Karg working under someone else's management. The second answer is the price. Analysts have warned that if Karg's oil facilities were damaged, Brent could reach $120 a barrel, with some forecasting considerably higher. Now, we've been there. Brent exceeded $115 in late March during the seizure scare. West Texas Intermediate touched an intraday high of $119.47 on March 9th. So this isn't a forecast about something unprecedented. It's a forecast about a return. And Washington has already watched what those prices do politically. Gas is currently just under $4 a gallon. The midterm elections are under 4 months away. In March polling, the president's weakest numbers were on the cost of living, around 36% approval, 62% disapproval. Destroying Karg would remove roughly 1.5 million barrels a day from a market already missing a fifth of its normal Hormuz flow. 4 months before an election, in an economy where the World Bank has already cut global growth to 2.5%, its lowest since the pandemic. And there's a third answer that gets less attention. China is Karg's main buyer. Destroying Karg wouldn't primarily hurt Iran's ability to pump oil. It would sever the pipeline of discounted Iranian crude flowing to Beijing, the same Beijing whose enormous strategic stockpiling has, by some analysts' reckoning, been the main reason oil hasn't spiked far higher in this war. Whether Washington sees that as a feature or a risk is a genuine open question, and I don't think the public record answers it. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has called China an unreliable global partner over its supply hoarding. But blowing up China's discount supplier during a war in which Chinese demand restraint is holding your own gas prices down is, at minimum, complicated. Now flip it. For Iran, Karg isn't a strategic asset, it's the treasury. Between 90 and 96% of crude exports. Iran's oil revenue is the state's revenue. It funds the government, the military, the Revolutionary Guard, the subsidy system that keeps bread and fuel affordable for a population already under enormous strain. Lose Karg, and you don't lose a percentage of income. You lose the mechanism by which income arrives. The fallback is real but thin. As in the 1980s, Iran can shift loading to Levan and Sir Islands. Those are smaller facilities in shallower water. They cannot berth the largest tankers. and they cannot move anything close to Karg's volumes. Iran also holds substantial inventory on the island itself. Kepler put stocks at roughly 18 million barrels in early March, about 58% of capacity, giving Tehran a buffer to smooth exports through disruption. A buffer is not a solution, it's a countdown, which brings us to the strange symmetry at the center of this war. Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz, the artery through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas normally passes. It has used that control aggressively, forbidding passage, boarding, and attacking merchant ships. Laying sea mines, daily tanker transits fell from an average of 84 to fewer than 10. Commercial vessel traffic went from around 140 a day to near zero. The United States controls the ability to destroy cargo at any moment of its choosing. Each side holds a gun to the other's economy, and neither has fired. There's not peace. It's a standoff, and standoffs are what produce the strange calm in the oil price that everyone keeps failing to explain. So if you don't want to destroy it and you want total control of it, the logic points one direction: take it. And the United States has been visibly preparing to do exactly that, on and off, for 4 months. Reports in March describe roughly 2,500 Marines and an amphibious assault ship heading to the region. Then a further 2 units of similar size, bringing a potential ground force to more than 7,000 troops. There were reports of 5,000 Marines and sailors sent to the Gulf, and 3,000 paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne deploying to the Middle East. American planning reportedly envisioned a preparatory phase of strikes, lasting several weeks before any ground action, an assault requiring either an amphibious landing or a heliborne insertion. Senator Lindsey Graham, who has been influential in shaping the president's Iran policy, argued on X that seldom in warfare does an enemy provide you a single target like Karg Island that could dramatically alter the outcome of a conflict. He's not wrong about the target. The question is what happens after you take it. Here's the case against, and it's the reason I think the landing keeps not happening. Analysts have pointed out the central flaw. Seizing Karg would have a severely negative effect on the world economy, and Iran would still control the Strait of Hormuz. Sit with that. You would spend 7,000 troops, accept casualties, cross the threshold from air war to ground war and occupation of sovereign Iranian territory, and Iran would still be able to close the waterway, carrying a fifth of the world's energy. You'd have taken Iran's revenue. You would not have taken Iran's leverage, and you'd have handed Tehran the strongest possible argument for keeping Hormuz shut permanently. Since it would no longer have export income to protect, the operation solves the wrong problem, and the threats themselves have wobbled. The Council on Foreign Relations headlined its June coverage, "Trump walks back threat to strike a critical Iranian oil hub." That's 4 months of the most heavily telegraphed amphibious operation in modern memory, repeatedly announced, never launched, which is itself a form of strategy. The threat of taking Karg is arguably worth more than taking it. It's free leverage that costs nothing as long as it stays a threat. The moment you use it, it's spent. And you own an occupied island in the middle of a war. Now we can answer the question we opened with. Why is oil around $90 in a war that has taken a fifth of global energy flows offline? Because the market has correctly identified that the worst-case scenario is being deliberately avoided by both parties. Look at what the price has actually done. Through mid-July, as the war spread to Iraqi oil infrastructure and the Red Sea, Brent held around $85 to $86. When Hormuz transit collapsed by 62%, it moved, but modestly. On Monday, Brent hit a 5-week high of $91.42, then surrendered, and almost all of it within hours, as a 10-day ceasefire proposal reached Tehran. That's a market trading a narrow band between two events that haven't happened. The two pivots, a strike on Karg or a ceasefire, still have not fired. Everything else is noise. Iraq, force majeure, noise. Kuwaiti refineries burning, noise. Houthi embargo on Saudi Arabia, noise. Attacks on the Caspian pipeline terminal on Russia's Black Sea coast, noise. All real, all damaging, all already priced. The market is watching one island, and there's a deadline nobody is talking about. The June 17th memorandum guaranteed commercial ships free transit through Hormuz for 60 days. That window closes around the middle of August. Iran's ambassador to China has already said transit fees are coming, with special considerations for friendly countries. So in roughly 4 weeks, either a toll regime begins on a fifth of the world's oil, or somebody has to prevent it. That is the moment when the card question stops being theoretical. 3 things to watch. 1. Whether the 10-day truce proposal holds. Mediators pushed it to Tehran this week. If it lands, oil drops fast. If it collapses, the pressure returns immediately. 2. The mid-August transit deadline. 60 days of free passage expire. What replaces them has not been publicly agreed by anyone. 3. Cargo tanks. Every morning, satellite imagery tells you whether the calculation still holds. As long as those 55 tanks are standing, both sides are still choosing the standoff over the catastrophe. 16 American service members have died in this war. The president has said Tehran will be held responsible for the deaths of 3 of them in Jordan last week. 10 straight nights of strikes. Iraq's exports gone. Kuwait's infrastructure burning. And a coral island, the size of an airport, 55 oil tanks intact, loading tankers as if nothing were happening at all. That's not an oversight. That's the only part of this war both sides have agreed on. The calculation held for 5 months. It doesn't pum anymore. State what was hit, when, and on whose confirmation. The question now isn't whether oil returns to $120, it's whether Iran's remaining export capacity through Lebanon and Syria can move anything at all. And what a state, with no oil revenue and continued control of the Strait of Hormuz, decides it has left to lose.